the defeat due to their knowledge of the surrounding lands. Fleeing westwards with the remnants of their army, Ethelred and Alfred halted somewhere in the hills west of Reading on the fourth day. Halfdan and Bagsec, having their West Saxon enemy on the back foot, were eager to shatter their resolve completely with a finishing blow. The two armies eventually resolved to do battle. The invaders had divided their numbers into two main divisions, one under the direct command of Halfdan and Bagsec, the second under the remaining Jarls. Mirroring this, King Ethelred retained command of one division of his Viking foes regardless. Asser writes that, acting courageously like a wild boar, and with God's help, Alfred pressed on regardless. His division formed into the tight shield wall. The enemy possessed the higher ground, though, as Asser points out, Alfred's warriors were spurred on to fight for their lands, loved ones, and their very lives. The battle raged, Asser assures us, around a small and solitary thorn tree, the Saxon and Viking lines clashing to and fro for many hours. As for the delaying Ethelred, his mass concluded, he too joined the battle after Alfred had already engaged with both heathen divisions. This dimension of the battle is somewhat arguable. Asser is a good source, yet firmly Alfred's man, and likely to play down his elder brother's role to the benefit of his hero. It's entirely possible that the delay was deliberate. However, whatever the case, Ethelred's intervention arguably turned the tide. During the frenzied melee, Bagsec himself was slain, along with 5 Jarls. Halfdan survived the day, ordering his warriors to retreat back to Reading. Asser states that many were slain into the night, though the battle failed to utterly destroy the Viking force. Ashdown, however, was an undoubted West Saxon victory, though the cheers of victory may have been dampened with news of a new offensive. Having sufficiently rested for a fortnight, Halfdan struck southwards towards the royal Ville of Basing. Though battered and perhaps unbelieving at this turn of ill fortune, Ethelred and Alfred once more led their Fyrd to engage the invaders. However, this time, as Asser succinctly states, after a long struggle, the Vikings gained the victory. Asser then has Guthrum's reinforcements arriving. However, as he also wrote before that many of Halfdan's hosts had been lost at Ashdown, this means the Vikings won an impressive victory with lesser numbers at Basing, assuming they had yet to be reinforced. Whatever the case, West Saxon luck did not improve. Later in March, Ethelred and Alfred fought their last battle together at a place called Merden or Merton. Here they suffered a defeat comparable to that of Halfdan's at Ashdown, in that many important Saxon leaders fell. 2 more dark events then proceeded to shake the kingdom of Wessex to its core. First was the aforementioned news of the arrival of a so-called Great Summer Army at Reading, but secondly was the loss of the king. Though somewhat smeared by his depiction at Ashdown, King Ethelred had undoubtedly fought a grueling and brave defense of his people. The Fyrd of Wessex had fought 4 battles by the time of Basing, and at this 5th encounter, Ethelred may have been mortally wounded and died soon after. Yet not all was lost. Likely prior to his last battle at Merton, Ethelred, Alfred, and the Witan had retired to the unknown location of Swinbjorg, where it was resolved that Alfred would succeed as king if his brother fell. With Ethelred buried with all honour at Wimborne, it was thus Alfred, the wild boar of Ashdown, that took up the mantle and sword of kingship. He would have much to do. On a May day of 878, King Alfred of Wessex marches determinedly towards the clash that may decide both his destiny and the survival of his kingdom. Alfred roars his own encouragement, raising the spirits of the nearby Fyrd, while insults and war cries are exchanged from two solid shield walls that inch ever closer towards the bloody struggle. The battle was about to begin. Perhaps few men in the dark days of the April of 871 would have envied the task before King Alfred of Wessex. The last living son of King Ethelwulf, himself a scion of Egbert, the founder of their line, indeed the survival of both Alfred's house and of an independent Wessex, hung by a fragile thread. With two of the major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms conquered, part of the great heathen army had infiltrated south in late 870, though not without incident. With his elder brother and king, Alfred had fought 4 battles, being bested at Reading, and later Basing and Meriden, though the brothers battered the heathens into defeat at Ashdown between the first two. Indeed, Alfred had certainly proved his mettle as both a warrior and leader, holding his own with his smaller force just long enough for King Ethelred to enter the fray and complete the victory. For his heroic courage and defense of his kingdom that day, the young Atheling earned his sobriquet, the Wild Boar of Ashdown. Yet despite their success, the heathen army was far from vanquished. Though reduced at Englefield and Ashdown, Halfdan's men were reinforced by the timely arrival of a great summer army. Compounding their misfortune, King Ethelred himself was wounded in a later battle and died of his wounds by April of 871. Alas, the beginning of Alfred's own kingship was not marked by some great decisive victory in the field. Just a month after his accession, the king fought a hard day-long battle on a hill above Wilton. Despite his grit and undoubted courage, Alfred and his people were being ground down to defeat. Following Wilton, Alfred sent word to Reading that he would buy his peace. Though not outright admitted, it's almost certain the king won his peace through a substantial payment. However, this process would not have endeared him to his own folk. After decades of raids, the southern English economy was flat, the coinage of the kingdoms debased to the extent that peace was likely bought with portable items such as crosses, chalices, rings, and torques, among many others. Having wrung what they could from the battered West Saxons, Halfdan and his men withdrew east to London. Yet if the West Saxons had initially given them a bloody nose, any such concern about King Burgred's Mercia would have quickly evaporated. Burgred was keen to buy off the heathens once more, rather than endure any battle, and perhaps similarly eroded his own authority and support that much more as cartloads of precious goods flowed into occupied London. Yet as 872 progressed, the invaders would not have it all their own way. The puppets installed in conquered Northumbria had been overthrown. Client King Egbert and Archbishop Wulfhere of York fled into the arms of Burgred in Mercia. However, though acting swiftly to stamp out resistance in York itself, the entirety of the heathen host was ominously not committed to the effort.
अब नहीं सहेंगे, बदल के रहेंगे। देखिए कहते हैं सर्दी के मौसम में यहाँ का लक्षण ही।
Halfdan, in fact, moved the bulk of his men to Torksey in the former kingdom of Lindsey. The aristocracy of the area had, over time, been subsumed into the Mercian orbit through intermarriage, making Halfdan's choice of camp there alarming to Burgred. Continuing to receive tribute here, Burgred must have eventually concluded that this latest headache was not going to subside. Indeed, Halfdan had a plan for the meek Mercians. Having installed another English puppet on the Northumbrian throne, Burgred may have breathed a sigh of relief when informed Halfdan had struck camp from Torksey. However, his heart must have been in his mouth at the news of their destination. Having continually bled Burgred dry throughout 873, the invaders rooted themselves in the Mercian royal centre of Repton. This act was a deafening message to both the kingdom and to the long-reigning Burgred in particular, that his days were done. Despite his 22-year reign, the royalty buried at Repton were not of his dynasty. The implication was clear. They affiliated themselves with the older kings and even buried some of their own dead at the place. From Repton, waves of raiding continued to plague the kingdom, and with no serious resistance offered, King Burgred ultimately fled to Rome, along with Alfred's older sister, Ethelswith. As in York, the invaders favored installing a puppet for the time being, described as a foolish king's thane. Having now toppled 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the great heathen army brooded throughout 874 on their next move. Halfdan felt his future lay in the north, and with a portion of the army headed to a base on the Tyne, from where he could attack the Picts and the Celts of Strathclyde. Meanwhile, the rest of the army, now under the trio of Guthrum, Ossatel, and Anwen, headed south to Cambridge. Yet, unfortunately for Alfred, Guthrum had designs on this last defiant kingdom. The first ominous sign of a resumption of war was a naval action in the summer of 875. Alfred himself led his men against 7 enemy vessels, capturing one and driving the others to flight. A small victory, to be sure, but one soon overshadowed by a much greater threat. At some time either later that year or earlier in the next, Guthrum's army made its move. Alfred had not been negligent of the danger, as is indicated by timing of the invasion. West Saxon scouts had long observed the enemy camp. However, Guthrum ordered the advance into Wessex during the night, and given Alfred swift mustering of their fear to resist them, the arrival at Wareham was impressive. Guthrum's occupation of Wareham must have been both a shock and humiliation to Alfred and his army. Around 140 miles from Cambridge, Guthrum thus successfully avoided direct confrontation, riding through the heart of Alfred's domain, and now occupying this important royal centre. Yet as audacious as this was, Alfred could have been forgiven a moment of confused amusement, as now his enemy was battled up deep within his own heartland and far from overland supply. However, appearances were deceptive, as news soon trickled in that a large Viking fleet had been sighted off the south coast. With the scales balanced so, Alfred once again turned to negotiation to rid Wessex of his foe. As in 871, an agreement was reached that Guthrum would leave the kingdom, the usual hostages exchanged, and the deal sealed with an unusual pledge of faith. Whereas before the heathens had sworn upon Christian relics, this time Guthrum swore upon his own people's holy ring. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, this was something never before conceded to any folk. Another source, Ethelwerd, suggests a more unbalanced arrangement in which payment was once again offered to encourage their departure. Whatever hopes Alfred may have had following the talks, though, they were shattered at the news of Guthrum's swift betrayal. Instead of marching back to East Anglia or Mercia, the enemy moved by night west to Exeter. The ancient walled city provided further shelter to the invading army, but may also have presented a greater threat, still given Guthrum could potentially link up with disaffected Cornishmen to the west. The Cornish were certainly no friends of the House of Egbert, their father suffering defeat at Hingston Down decades before. Certainly a new Viking-Cornish alliance was not entirely unthinkable. Whatever Guthrum's plans, however, fortune's wheel now scuppered them. His fleet setting out from Poole Harbour had been smashed to bits in a storm of truly biblical proportions. Barely a few miles into their voyage, a great storm struck the 120-strong fleet near Swanage, with a loss of all hands. At a stroke, Guthrum's leverage vanished. Encircling Exeter, an enraged Alfred, now reassured he was in the right, now had Guthrum over the metaphorical barrel. The Chronicle reports that Guthrum conceded as many hostages as Alfred demanded, and specifically men of enough import to deter another reneging of their agreement. So, by the summer of 877, Guthrum and his army finally retired from Wessex. At Gloucester, within Ceolwulf's Mercia, Guthrum activated the previous arrangement agreed after Repton. Part of the kingdom would remain under Ceolwulf, with Gloucester itself and the east distributed among Guthrum's men. This cultural and legal splitting of the ancient Middle Kingdom would endure for centuries, Watling Street effectively setting the Danelaw boundary in the immediate future. Back south, Alfred may have thinly hoped the dismantling of Mercia had satisfied Guthrum, but if so, he was to be brutally corrected. Previously, though negotiations had eventually forced Guthrum's withdrawal from Exeter, the heathen leader had been in no great hurry to depart, his occupation lasting several months, and it's entirely possible that during this period, Guthrum entertained the more disaffected elements of Alfred's subjects.
Step up your game with unbeatable offers on footwear only at Myntra Right to Fashion Sale.
Nivea Soft मेरी स्किन को दे मॉर्निंग वाली फ्रेशनेस with 2x ज्यादा मॉइस्चराइजर्स और नो चिट फील। इसके न्यू एंड इम्प्रूव्ड फॉर्मूला में है 100% नेचुरल जोजोबा ऑयल। ये दे मुझे फ्रेश ग्लोइंग स्किन। Nivea Soft.
सबसे कम महंगाई दिल्ली के अंदर है, सबसे कम महंगाई।
कितना झूठ बोलते हैं ये लोग, ये बातें सुन सुनकर तो मेरे कान पक गए। यहाँ वाले वहाँ वाले सब ने अपने महल बना लिए, लेकिन हमारी तो महंगाई से कमर ही तोड़ दी। अब तो सिर्फ कांग्रेस पर ही है भरोसा। जैसे कर्नाटक में कांग्रेस हर महीने महिलाओं को पैसे दे रही है, अब दिल्ली में भी देगी 2500 रुपए। प्यारी दीदी योजना, होगी हर जरूरत पूरी। कांग्रेस है जरूरी।
After Christmas of 877, Alfred had survived as the last remaining free king of Anglo-Saxon England through a mix of grit, bribery, and good fortune. However, where brute force alone had failed him in the past, Guthrum also now employed deception to oust the last free king. Alfred's payments to the enemy, while expedient and, in the short term, effective, also inevitably alienated some of the Witan upon whom the burden would fall to provide payment. Events came to a head at Chippenham, which Guthrum, with his characteristic stealth, fell upon during the 12th night Christmas celebrations. By the time of the attack, Alfred and his closest followers had fled. As it is later recorded that Alfred survived alone for some months, we can assume no support sufficient for the king to immediately muster the feared in response to Guthrum's attack. Asser himself describes Alfred's state of existence following Chippenham. King Alfred, with his small band of nobles, and also with certain soldiers and thanes, was leading a restless life in great distress amid the woody and marshy places of Somerset. He had nothing to live on except what he could forage by frequent raids, either secretly or openly, from the Vikings, as well as from the Christians who had submitted to the Vikings' authority. Whether or not treachery in the West Saxon court was afoot, the result, with his small band of nobles, and also with certain soldiers and thanes, was leading a restless life in great distress amid the woody and marshy places of Somerset. He had nothing to live on except what he could forage by frequent raids, either secretly or openly, from the Vikings, as well as from the Christians who had submitted to the Vikings' authority. Whether or not treachery in the West Saxon court was afoot, the result was undoubtedly the same. With Alfred and his few remaining followers fleeing from Guthrum, the entirety of Wessex was now at the pagan warlord's feet. With his men overrunning Wessex and the leadership of the king effectively neutralized, thoughts of Alfred skulking across the Channel in imitation of Burgred's flight may have occurred to Guthrum. Indeed, Asser writes this was the fate of many nobles during the time, choosing flight to the fight. It's true that such a devastating setback would have broken most men. However, King Alfred was not most men. During the earlier months of 878, far from succumbing to defeatism and despair, Alfred fought back as much as he could, biding his time in his fastness of Athelney. Despite military defeat and treachery, he was still the king of Wessex, and during this time, Alfred sent messages throughout Wessex, gathering support from those unwilling to bend the knee to Guthrum and his collaborators. He was going nowhere, and he would fight for his crown. It was also during this lowest ebb for Alfred that the legend of the burning of the cakes originates. Yet if this incident really did occur, it certainly marked Alfred's nadir in fortune. As had happened near Swanage with the enemy fleet, God would once again thwart a finishing blow to the house of Egbert. Guthrum had not merely rested on his laurels and planned a two-pronged push into western Wessex. Now Ubba, the brother of Halfdan, would sail from southern Wales to land behind Alfred's position, while Guthrum himself closed the trap from land. It was a decent plan, but had not reckoned on the actions of one who had remained loyal to his king. Odda, the Ealdorman of Devon, had rallied his men to the defence of Wessex in the previous weeks and settled his force at the stronghold of Kinwit. Ubba, with his fleet of 23 ships and around 1,200 men, landed nearby and set about encircling Odda. Apparently convinced the Saxons would be forced into surrender given the lack of water on the hill, Odda nonetheless gave every impression of hunkering in for the siege. In truth, the Ealdorman had a simple plan. In the distance below, perhaps he saw the Raven banner, bold and menacing in the breeze. As Halfdan's warriors had done to his lord at Reading, so Odda would sally down in a surprise attack. His target was that banner and the person of Ubba himself. So it was that Odda's charge smashed into Ubba's ranks, and indeed around 800 of the invaders' army lay dead. Ubba himself was among the slain, and now the sacred Raven banner was in the hands of one of Alfred's loyal ealdormen. The slaying of Ubba, last son of Ragnar, must have chilled the hearts of Guthrum and his host, while inspiring those of Alfred and his men. It must have been an unambiguous beacon to arms for the battered loyalists of Wessex. If not before, perhaps more and more messages of support began to flood into the Alfredian camp, and as winter gave way to spring, it would be Alfred who struck the next blow. Asser writes that around the 4th to the 10th of May, Alfred rode to King Egbert's Stone on the eastern end of Selwood. Alfred would be forgiven for holding his breath as he approached the mustering point. Could such a reversal in support from the betrayal of Chippenham be possible? Greeting him as in answer were some 4,000 men of Hampshire, Wiltshire, and Somerset, all who had answered the call. Camping at Selwood for a night, Alfred moved to Ely the next day, the location of another well-known gathering point. Perhaps Alfred meant to bolster his army further. Guthrum himself marched to intercept him at a place called Eddington. As with Ashdown several years before, the exact location of one of the more important battles of English history is not known for sure. Whether at Eddington Hill or Bratton Camp itself, Guthrum awaited Alfred's onslaught. Frustratingly, Asser skimps on the specific details of the action that day, though he writes, Alfred moved his forces and came to a place called Eddington, and fighting fiercely with a compact shield wall against the entire Viking army, he persevered resolutely for a long time. At length he gained the victory through God's will. Though describing battles of this period as long-lasting is quite typical, we have no solid reason to doubt this. If Guthrum's warriors held the ground advantage, and fear had that of numbers, the fight could easily have evolved into an hours-long slugging match. That the melee of battle swung decisively to the West Saxons is plain. Asser writing, Alfred destroyed the Vikings with great slaughter and pursued those who fled as far as the stronghold, hacking them down. The aforementioned lines imply much damage was inflicted before the general flight, and without the death of Guthrum himself, we can assume a major breach in the line or a severe drop in morale that preceded the collapse. Though inflicting heavy casualties before pursuit, Alfred mercilessly hunted the remnants to the very gates of Chippenham itself. Alfred's wrath may have been understandable. For months he had been a fugitive in his own lands, perhaps forced to flee by treachery from within the ranks of his own great men, and had now snatched victory from the very precipice of defeat. Fortune's wheel now revolved full circle. Surrounding Guthrum's remaining men within Chippenham, the West Saxons killed any man caught outside, and seized all goods and animals in the vicinity. Encamping at Guthrum's doorstep, Alfred settled down, content to wait for either the surrender or starvation of his foes within. 2 weeks into their ordeal, Guthrum finally accepted defeat. Unlike earlier encounters, there would be no negotiation or talk of hostage exchange. Guthrum alone would yield what hostages the king demanded and would receive not a single coin in payment. In addition, Alfred required Guthrum and his leading men to convert to the Christian faith. With little choice, it was agreed. Just 3 weeks after the siege had concluded, Guthrum was indeed baptized, close to where just weeks before, Alfred had languished in internal exile. The event was more than just a spiritual conquest of the Christian God over Guthrum's pagan idols. Alfred too was demonstrating his own earthly superiority over his defeated foe, sponsoring Guthrum himself, acting as godfather and conferring precious gifts on him and his lieutenants. The later treaty of Alfred and Guthrum divided up Mercia between Danish and West Saxon spears, an arrangement that would endure. For Alfred, it was better to have a reformed friend than a dead pagan enemy. Alfred recognized Guthrum as the Christian king of East Anglia, and he would indeed rule East Anglia as Aethelstan, this arrangement granting Alfred and Wessex a crucial relative peace in the years to come. Though other Viking incursions would have to be faced, the long reconquest of former Anglo-Saxon lands had only just begun. When we think of famous English medieval battles, Hastings or Bosworth Field may come to mind, both of these being dynasty-ending events, with other battles like Agincourt, Crécy, and Poitiers of the 100 Years' War also featuring heavily in the public consciousness. Arguably, however, the most important battle of medieval England was fought well over 100 years before Duke William's conquest, with the year of 937 perhaps as deserving of recall and renown as that of 1066. For it was the Battle of Brunanburh that effectively settled the question of England and defined the countries of Britain to this day. Alfred the Great's remarkable reign, in which he settled and fortified the old kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia, ended in 899, which saw further Saxon expansion north and east under his son and daughter, Edward the Elder, and Ethelflad, the Lady of the Mercians. The Elder's reign saw him inherit Alfred's title of King of the Anglo-Saxons, which his father took upon taking London and accepting Ethelred, Lord of the Mercians, as his vassal in 886. Edward expanded the realm from this unified territory and to the border of the Kingdom of York. Upon the death of his father in 924, however, Aethelstan, the Elder's eldest son, was hailed as king in Mercia, though his succession was initially challenged in Wessex by Elfweard, Edward's son by a different wife. Since questions over the legitimacy over Edward's first marriage lingered at the time, many saw Aethelstan as the inferior Atheling.
Luckily for Alfred's dream of a united England, Ælfweir did not long outlive his father, dying mysteriously just a couple of weeks later. Thus, with his half-brother's demise, Aethelstan took lordship of all his father's domain. Aethelstan was crowned in Kingston upon Thames, located on the border between Mercia and Wessex, likely a deliberate act to demonstrate that, like his father and grandfather, he was lord of all the Anglo-Saxons. In addition, Archbishop of Canterbury Æthelm created a new religious service in which the king wore a crown rather than a traditional helmet. Opposition still plagued the early reign of Aethelstan, with another plot emerging by an obscure lord known as Alfred, who schemed to blind the king and replace him with his younger brother Edwin. But during a sea voyage in 933, Edwin too mysteriously perished in a shipwreck designed to result in his death. With his rivals being prone to accidents, Aethelstan managed to strengthen his position, and perhaps the most significant event of his reign came early on in 927, when Aethelstan took the title King of the English and discarded his former title King of the Anglo-Saxons. Though the reigns of his grandfather Alfred, and especially his father Edward, had seen the spectacular rise of the House of Egbert, from the lowest ebb of Alfred's internal exile in 871, to his victory at Edington, and then to the borders of the last Viking stronghold of York, just a generation later, neither Aethelstan's father or grandfather claimed this land or the title. So it was that in 926, the king had made inroads into incorporating York by arranging the marriage of his sister to Sitric. In another lucky twist of fate, however, Sitric died just a year into their accord, presenting King Aethelstan with a golden opportunity to absorb this last bastion of Danish domination into his own kingdom, which he gleefully did. The Danes reluctantly accepted Aethelstan's lordship, though this new enlarged Saxon kingdom unnerved other powerful men in Britain, including Constantine II, King of Alba. Constantine, as well as King Owain of Strathclyde, the King of Delabath, and the Lord of Bamber, all acknowledged Aethelstan's overlordship, but this stability would not last. This new kingdom presented a dangerous shift in power that could in theory overwhelm any of the smaller kingdoms. However, Constantine and the others wagered that Aethelstan's might was not yet equal to all of them combined. Constantine formed an alliance with the Strathclyde Celts. He forged another alliance with the Kingdom of Dublin by marrying his daughter to Olaf Guthfrithson, who sought to retake Northumbria, which was briefly ruled by his father less than a decade prior. Meanwhile, thinking that the north was secured, Aethelstan reaffirmed his suzerainty over the kings of Wales, who had previously submitted to both Alfred and his aunt Ethelflad, and he now, in turn, inherited this. Further afield, Aethelstan proved he was not a mere warlord, but a clever politician and diplomat. Building on the old tradition of the West Saxon court, he maintained relations with the Carolingian court, for it was Aethelstan's great-grandfather, Ethelwulf, that married Judith, a Carolingian princess, with his own father, Egbert, the family's founder, even living within Charlemagne's court during a period of exile before the rise of his own house. Thus, Aethelstan, like Ethelwulf, claimed the prestige of marrying into the Carolingian dynasty. Though he never married himself, he did have a number of sisters available to forge links across the channel. Edgifu was married to Charles the Simple himself, even mothering the future king, Louis IV. The young king Aethelstan also did one better, by forging another prestigious marriage between his sister Eadgith and Otto I, Holy Roman Emperor. Aethelstan also intervened directly in foreign affairs, harboring the aforementioned Louis IV during a period of exile, and even helping to reinstate Alan II as Duke of Brittany, following the region's conquest by Vikings, in 936. Indeed, Ethelstan's court was most likely the most cosmopolitan of the Anglo-Saxon period, through such close links with other European courts. Extending King Alfred's legal reforms and founding many new churches, Aethelstan also proved to be a wise domestic ruler, maintaining West Saxon dominance in Wales by exacting a heavy annual tribute. Welsh and Scots leaders, including Constantine, even attended his charter meetings, with the king creating an effective central government, granting larger responsibilities to ealdormen of his kingdom, who traditionally had only governed shires, as opposed to larger territories under the king. And Ethelstan's military success went from strength to strength. He pushed the Cornish out of the city of Exeter and fortified its walls, establishing a border at the Tamar. In 934, the king began a march on Scotland, perhaps to reinforce his authority over the north generally. One possible excuse, according to John of Worcester, is that Constantine broke his treaty with Aethelstan. The king was accompanied on campaign by 4 Welsh kings, as well as a retinue of 18 bishops and 13 earls. This campaign proved overwhelming, given that according to Simeon of Durham, the English attacked in a two-pronged way, ravaging by land as far as northeast Scotland, and raiding by sea as far as Caithness, and even possibly to the Norse-held Orkneys. 935 does have a charter attested to by Constantine, Owain of Strathclyde, as well as the Welsh kings. Meanwhile, Olaf, the King of Dublin, and Owain of Strathclyde made ready to aid their ally, Constantine. By the autumn of 937, Olaf was ready and invaded northern England with Constantine and Owain, hoping to cut the overmighty English king down to size. The timing of the attackers was unusual, given campaigning typically took place in summer, and caught Aethelstan off guard initially. Though once news began to filter through of this new threat, the king began to gather the fiefs of Mercia and Wessex together. Meanwhile, the Northern Coalition ravaged English-controlled land as they moved south. Aethelstan's own army finally moved to meet the coalition in what subsequent generations would merely call the Great Battle, so called for its bloody ferocity. Bizarrely, for such an important battle, we actually don't know for sure where it was fought, though the leading candidate is near the village of Bromborough on the Wirral. The battle lasted all day and was hard fought. According to the poem Battle of Bromborough in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the two lines of men fought in the traditional shield wall formation, with Aethelstan's warriors eventually gaining the upper hand by hewing their way through a part of the coalition shield wall and breaking through. This breakthrough effectively ended the battle, with the coalition men fleeing. Olaf managed to flee the field back to Dublin, with Constantine also surviving the chaos, though Owain's fate is not mentioned. The victory ultimately settled the matter of a unified and permanent kingdom of England, which would endure to its current form today. Ethelstan's golden reign would end just 2 years later in 939, ushering in a quick series of kings, before the longer and more disastrous reign of King Ethelred the Unready. Ethelstan's England, though, would endure a renewed Danish conquest in 1016 by King Canute the Great in the Battle of Ascendun. The House of Wessex was temporarily restored in 1042, before a new foreign line under William the Conqueror seized the crown after a far more famous Battle of Hastings in 1066. The importance of Brennenburg, though, cannot be denied. If Constantine, Olaf, and Owain had triumphed in 937, it's possible that much of Ethelstan's gains could have been reversed, with York and Northumbria breaking off once more under the Danes, and perhaps more territory ceded to the others. The principle of English overlordship would have been seriously damaged, perhaps provoking further rebellions in Wales and Cornwall, likely fragmenting the young England irreparably. But the tide of history ultimately bent towards English unity. We shall never truly know, yet it's not hard to see how this battle was just as important for the history of England as the Battle of Hastings over a century later, with Athelstan arguably creating the England that William would later conquer. And you can see both the Battle of Assundoon and the Battle of Hastings on our channel. Find the links at the end of this video. If you stayed around this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm. You can also support us on Patreon and get ad-free early access to our videos for as little as $1, or by clicking the thanks button below to leave a one-time tip. As always, we'll see you in the next one.
Stand out from the crowd with the latest trends at a minimum 50% off only at Myntra Right to Fashion sale.
ये बताओ, जब 10-minute delivery के साथ मिले lowest prices on fruits, veggies, groceries and more, तो सारी शॉपिंग तो Zepto Super Zero पे ही होगी ना? एक काम करो, इनसे सस्ता ढूंढ कर दिखाओ। ढूंढो ना प्लीज।
Zepto Super Zero, lowest prices, no delivery fee, 10-minute delivery.
It is a cool summer morning on the slopes of the Apennine Mountains. On the shores of the river Tiber, the bustling town of Tifernum awoke to the noise of the carpenter and his apprentices as they started work on a wealthy trader's veranda, bright and early. The local dressmaker hurried down the main street to her customer, used to hearing the usual catcalling by the baker and fishmonger. As the other tradesmen opened their shops, just outside the town, a Roman army was marching by, commanded by Fabius Maximus. Heading south towards Samnium, they advanced towards the narrow valley just south of Tifernum. There, hidden in the hillside forest, an army of 25,000 Samnites had set a trap. Many of you frequently ask me how I make my maps. Well, I mainly use Photoshop and After Effects, but new users may find that these apps have a steep learning curve, and that's where Skillshare comes in, the sponsor of today's video. Their Photoshop Beginner to Expert is a 12-hour course that will help you learn everything you need to know about the ins and outs of Photoshop. Once you have that done and dusted, you can then jump into creating fantasy maps with natural textures to begin making maps and slowly develop your own style to create beautiful looking maps. Moving to After Effects, Skillshare provides you with a wealth of classes that will turn you